Hi, this is Corey Franklin, and this is obitpage.com from Chicago. And this is the story of people who've died recently who've had an impact on history or American society. And tonight we're going to talk about the story of Betty Garrett, who died recently at the age of 91. She had a long life, and it was a sort of a tragic life. We've talked before about F. Scott Fitzgerald's quote, "There are no second acts in American life." Betty Garrett had a glamorous first act and an uplifting third act, but her second act is what we're going to concentrate on after we go through her first and third act. For her first act, Betty Garrett was an actress, a songstress, and a dancer. She was a quite talented woman and quite beautiful, and she was a star of the late 40s musicals, and her role was always the aggressive female trying to land the guy. Her most famous role, she was in Take Me Out to the Ball Game, she was in a couple of the others, but her most famous role, unquestionably, in the 40s was On the Town with Frank Sinatra, where she plays the aggressive female cab driver who's trying to get Frank Sinatra to be her boyfriend. And they have a great relationship together, and she finally succeeds in getting Frank Sinatra to fall in love with her at the top of the Empire State Building. And here is the song where they fall in love at night with the lights of New York below them.
You're old, dear, old with worldly wisdom, old like Gorgonzola, old like vintage French champagne. You're so kind of charming, so kind of witty, so I can't explain.
Can't stand you, I can't stand you to give some fella the eye. Can't see you in the arms of another guy who needs you to distraction, needs you till he's crazy, needs you rain or shine. I'm the one who needs you, and I think you're awful nice to say you're mine.
She more than held her own with Sinatra in that role, and she was quite good in those musical roles. And in fact, we'll play one of her famous songs at the end of the program tonight. But around 1950, her career fell off, and you didn't hear from her for 20 years. And we'll go through that in a little while. Skip forward to the early 1970s, and Betty Garrett, who was a pretty big star in the late 40s, comes back, and she comes back on television, and she comes back in the most popular sitcom of the early 1970s, All in the Family. Norman Lear had been associated with her early in her career, and Norman Lear asked her to be on All in the Family in the early 70s, and here she talks a little bit about it.
I was the next door neighbor with Vince Gardenia was my husband. I was Irene Lorenzo, and I was Irish and Vince was Italian. And so, of course, immediately that whatever you were with Archie, he was against. And we moved into the neighborhood in place of the Jeffersons who were there before. It was a wonderful show, so well written.
Here are Archie and Irene Lorenzo sparring briefly. This is Betty Garrett and Carol O'Connor on All in the Family.
I'm be asking, but does your husband do a lot of the cooking over your house?
He does all of it. He loves it.
Oh, well, ain't you a little afraid of what people could think?
You mean that I'm a lazy wife?
No, that he's a fag. No, I don't think that. I mean, of course, I know he's Italian. And Italians are always bothering women.
Then there must be a little Italian in you.
Well, she's right. It was a well-written show, and Betty Garrett moved on from that show to, she got a recurring role in Laverne and Shirley. She was the upstairs landlady for Laverne and Shirley, and she did that for several years, and she did a great job at it. So those were the first and third acts in Betty Garrett's life. I might also add that when she got married, the best man at their wedding was Lloyd Bridges, and Lloyd Bridges made Betty Garrett the godmother of her two sons. So she's the godmother of Beau Bridges and this guy.
I'm the dude, so that's what you call me, that or his dudeness or duder or, El Duderino if you're not into the whole brevity thing.
That's right. Your trivia for today is that Betty Garrett was the godmother of Jeff Bridges, the current big star. He's in True Grit right now as Rooster Cogburn. But I want to talk about the real story of Betty Garrett's life. And the real story of Betty Garrett's life are those 2 decades between the early 50s and the 1970s. And it has to do with her marriage and what happened. She was married to an actor named Larry Parks, and Larry Parks was a big name in the 40s. He won an Academy Award nomination for a biopic. He starred as Al Jolson, and he was one of the biggest stars of the time. But what happened was that Larry Parks and Betty Garrett were part of the Blacklist. They were probably the most important performers, as opposed to writers or anybody else. They were the most important performers to be victimized by the Blacklist. And I'm going to let Betty Garrett tell her story of the Blacklist. And this is something that she really clarifies a lot of what went on during that time. And she also gives a little portrayal of Joe McCarthy. I think you get an idea of what kind of person Joe McCarthy was. Betty Garrett on the Blacklist of her and her husband, Larry Park.
It affected Larry, of course, very badly because he was called among the 19 that were called. Actually, he was called the first time, and they stopped the investigation just before he was supposed to testify. Then he was called back several years later. But we had that hanging over us for several years, knowing that he probably would be called back again. And we lived on kind of tenterhooks because of that. When he was called, he chose to admit that he had been a member of the Communist Party, but he did not want to name names, which to me is very understandable. They were very adamant and took him into private session, and it was a very humiliating time for him and for me too. And I suspect, and Larry told me once, he thought this was true, that I was supposed to be called too at the same time, but I was 9 months pregnant, and I don't think they thought it was a good idea to get me up on stand. It was not a very good picture. He was on a list of what they call subversive people because he had been a member of the Communist Party, which, everyone sort of well-thinking people in those days were allied with progressive organizations because they were the only ones that were doing anything about discrimination, about better housing, and things like that. And you felt a sense of justice. You wanted to be part of it. And certainly that's why I was. My involvement seemed to be mostly doing benefits. I was doing benefits for every good cause. And Larry's was quite slight, but, it was all for causes that were understandably that you would be sympathetic to. At that point, he had done the Jolson story. So he was a big star. And I've always felt that that's why he was called, because he was good headlines. And the day that he testified, or was called up, the headlines on the newspapers were that big. Larry Parks admits being commie. The very next day, Truman dismissed MacArthur, and the headlines then went to that item. But it's funny because Larry's headline was above something very world-shaking. There were just little headlines for that. in this big, huge headline, because he was a big star. He was a big Hollywood star. The Jolson story was the first movie, I think, in Hollywood to make in the first year something like $10 million. Now, that's nothing today, but in those days, that was a very big profit for a movie to make. And he was famous all over the world. We went to London and played the provinces in England 3 times, and Larry was like Frank Sinatra, the screaming fans and everything. So that picture was very popular every place, in Europe as well as the United States. So, you know, as I say, he was big headlines for the committee. It's a very hard thing. He was not hired. That was the thing. And you could never put a face on it. You just find out that he was up for something, and then all of a sudden somebody said, no, he's not hireable. And you couldn't track it down to any one person. Or I know our manager lawyer was thinking that he could sue somebody if he could just put a name on that person and say, you have no right to keep this person from working on the basis of his political beliefs. And but you could never tie it down to any person or organization or anything. A couple of times he was up for something. The most ironic one was there was a big television show that was going to be based on heaven. And all the great entertainers were in heaven, great comics and, you know, people. And so naturally, Larry was up for the part of Al Jolson. And all of a sudden, the job was not there. He was supposed to get the job, and then all of a sudden they said they changed their mind. And the excuse was he was not the type, you know, which you have to laugh. You know, it was an unfortunate thing, and it was humiliating for Larry. And so we just, Larry went into the building business and built apartment houses.
Did you have friends that were affected by the blacklist?
Oh, yeah. A lot of friends were. It was an odd situation because people took sides, and that was the saddest thing about it, is some people felt that Larry should have taken the fifth as some of the others did, and would snub him. But since then, those same people have said how foolish they were. I wish they hadn't done that. And then, of course, people who were on the side of the committee just wouldn't hire him.
Did you have any friends that were blacklisted as well?
Yeah. I mean, I don't want to list them.
Hedda Hopper had a pretty strong...
She had a vendetta against us. John Wayne came out with a statement after Larry, said he had been a communist, saying, well, it takes a man to admit, something like that. And Hedda Hopper came out and said, blasted John Wayne for saying that, as though he hadn't a right to, pat Larry on the back in any way.
Had you ever met Senator McCarthy?
My mind must have tried to deny it or something, but we had a very funny experience. I mean, as funny as it could be meeting Senator McCarthy. We played Las Vegas twice. Strangely enough, there was no blacklist in Las Vegas. At the end of the act, the Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer came back and said, Senator Joseph McCarthy would like to buy you a drink. And Larry and I looked at each other, and Larry said, what do you want to do? And I said, I don't want to have a drink with the old son of a bitch. But Larry had one of those inquisitive minds. He said, I want to meet this man face to face. I want to see what he's like. So we went out, and we were sitting in a big leather booth. The first thing McCarthy did was lift up his shirt and show us his kidney scar, the operation scar. It was like Lyndon Johnson doing it, And then he bought us a drink, and then he said to Larry, are they giving you a hard time, kid? And Larry looked at me and said, "You're asking me that?" And McCarthy said, "Well, let me give you a little motto. Bastardi non carborundum. Don't let the bastards grind you down." A little bit after that, we decided to, we got up and said thank you for the drink and left. The next morning, my mother had brought my two boys up. They were about 3 and 4 years old. And we went out, we had slept late, and we came out to the pool, and my mother had the boys out at the pool. And there in the pool was Senator McCarthy teaching my kids to swim. So they never understood why we got them out of the pool and made them take a bath in the middle of the day. But, I mean, it was a bizarre experience, to meet this man. My conclusion is that this man had no sense of morality at all. He was on a bandwagon and was, he had no sense of the destructiveness of what he had done. And he had just picked an attitude, I guess, or a cause that he thought would make him famous, which it did.
So for you younger listeners, that was the Blacklist. You can understand how in the 30s, during the Depression, when social conditions were bad, artists and a lot of people might have gravitated towards these type of causes, and maybe they knew about the connection with the Soviet Union and communism, maybe they did. It becomes harder to understand when you get to 1939 and Stalin made a pact with Hitler, and by the 40s, many people could see what kind of person Stalin really was. And even Larry Parks, before the House Un-American Activities Committee said being a communist in 1941 was completely different than being one in 1951. Of course, the dilemma that people had when they were called before the House Un-American Activities Committee in the 50s, the United States was a different place. The Russians had stolen A-bomb secrets and produced an A-bomb. China had gone communist. There was the Korean War going on, so there was fear of communism. There was a paranoia, and politicians exploited that. And the problem that people like Larry Parks had was that if they didn't go before the House Un-American Activities Committee, they could be thrown in jail for contempt of court. And if they did go, they would be asked not only whether they had been communists before, but they'd be asked to inform. And you could see that even Betty Garrett was a little uncomfortable with that. Larry Parks thought he could get by telling the truth that he had been a communist. He was a communist a little later into the 40s than maybe was a good thing. He did identify people that the committee knew were already communists, but it didn't save him. It ruined his career, and it destroyed Betty Garrett's career for 20 years, but she bounced back, and you have to give her a lot of credit for that. And it's a fascinating story of Larry Parks and Betty Garrett, who were two of the victims of the Blacklist, something that everyone should know about. So that's the tragic career and redemption of Betty Garrett. I'm going to close tonight with the song that she was the first to perform in the movies, back from her career in the 40s. And we played this song about 3 weeks ago with Margaret Whiting and Johnny Mercer, who wrote it. Betty Garrett played it with Red Skelton first in the movies. Again, her typical role is the aggressive female trying to land Red Skelton. This is the well-known song that we hear every Christmas.
I really can't
But
stay.
baby, it's cold outside.
I've got to go away.
Baby, it's cold outside.
This evening has
Been
been
hoping that you'd drop
so
in.
very nice.
I'll hold your hand. They're just like
My
ice.
mother will start to worry.
Beautiful, what's your
And father
hurry?
will be pacing the floor.
Listen to the fireplace
So
roar.
really, I'd better scurry.
Beautiful, please don't hurry.
Maybe just a little drink
Put
more.
some records on while I
The
pose.
neighbors might
But baby, it's bad out there.
say what's in this
No
drink.
cabs to be had out there.
I wish I knew
Your
how
eyes are like stars
to
right
break
now.
the spell.
I'll take your hat. Your hair looks
I ought to
bad.
say no, no,
Mind if I
senor.
move in
At
close?
least I'm going to say that I
What's
tried.
the sense of hurting my
I
pride?
really can't
Oh,
stay.
baby, don't hold out,
Oh,
baby,
but it's cold outside.